When dust storms buried entire farms and crops failed for 7 straight years, American families in the 1930s discovered something remarkable: 26 ingenious recipes that turned scraps into sustenance. These Dust Bowl survivors created meals from nothing, and their forgotten wisdom could feed your family today. Let's dive in. Water pie. Imagine baking a pie with no fruit, no custard, and no cream. Just water, sugar, and trust. That's what water pie was. A quiet miracle from the hardest years, it filled the house with the smell of dessert, even when there was nothing sweet to spare. Mothers poured plain water into an empty pie crust, then stirred in flour, sugar, and vanilla right in the shell. No bowl, no fuss. Butter pats floated on top, melting slowly as the oven worked its magic. What came out wasn't quite pudding, wasn't quite jelly. It was something in between, wobbly, glossy, and golden at the edges. You'd slice it warm and eat it with a fork, each bite holding a hint of caramel from the butter and a whisper of vanilla on your tongue. The crust went soft, the filling stayed just firm enough, and somehow it felt like a real treat. The kitchen smelled like hope, faint, sweet, and unexpected. You didn't need a pantry full of ingredients to make something special. You just needed a little sugar, a spoon of flour, and the will to try. Water pie? They'd laugh, shaking their heads. Can you believe that's dessert? But it was. It really was. Because even when the world outside was dry and mean, you could still make something that brought the family around the table with quiet smiles. And if you didn't have sugar for pie, folks had another trick. One that baked a whole cake from canned soup. Tomato soup cake. It sounds strange, maybe even wrong, but when canned milk was gone, butter was a memory, and fresh eggs were too precious to waste on dessert. Folks reached for the one thing they still had in the pantry: tomato soup. Tomato soup cake came together fast. A can of condensed tomato soup, a scoop of flour, sugar, baking soda, and a handful of raisins or nuts if you had 'em. No eggs, no butter. The soup replaced it all. Some added cinnamon, cloves, or nutmeg for warmth, anything to cover the tang and turn it into something sweet. Once it baked, the tomato flavor vanished like it was never there. What came out was soft, rich, and gently spiced, a moist, reddish-brown cake that didn't need frosting to feel finished. Just a dusting of sugar or a smear of leftover jam on top was plenty. Kids didn't ask what was in it. They just took a slice, then another. And when they found out, most didn't care, because for once there was cake after dinner, even in a house with no butter on the table. The oven warmed the whole kitchen. The scent filled every corner, cozy and sweet. And for a moment, it didn't feel like survival. It felt like celebration. "You made that with soup?" folks would ask. "Yes," came the answer. "And it fed us well." But if there was no oven and no soup, just a jar and some bread, families still found a way to make lunch out of the oddest pairing, one that stuck to your ribs and your memory. Peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwich. It was the sandwich that made no sense, but somehow it worked. Peanut butter and mayonnaise, creamy, salty, tangy, and rich. A Depression-era staple that stuck around long after the dust settled. When meat was too expensive and cheese too rare, this sandwich offered fat, protein, and comfort all in one bite. You'd smear peanut butter on one slice of bread, mayo on the other, then press them together and hope for the best. Some folks added sliced bananas, pickles, or even a leaf of lettuce to stretch it further. The first bite always caught you off guard. The mayo cooled the tongue, while the peanut butter clung to the roof of your mouth. Sweet, savory, soft, and oddly satisfying. It wasn't pretty, but it filled your stomach, and in those days, that mattered more than anything. The bread was usually dry, day-old or worse, but the spread softened it just enough to go down smooth. It was quick, no cooking needed, and could be wrapped in wax paper for the fields or the schoolyard. You didn't waste a single corner, not when food was rationed and lunchboxes were light. This sandwich might have made city kids wrinkle their noses, but out in the country, it was a humble blessing. "Don't knock it till you've tried it," folks used to say, and they meant it. The sandwich became a kind of joke and tradition, passed down with a grin and a story, because sometimes Survival came between two slices of bread. And when you wanted to turn that same mayonnaise into something grander, something you could slice and serve at a birthday table, that's when you learned how to make cake from mayo. Mayonnaise cake. When eggs were gone and butter cost more than rent, people got creative. Mayonnaise, that simple spread sitting in the icebox, became the secret to one of the richest, softest chocolate cakes ever made. The idea sounds strange today, but back then, mayo made perfect sense. It was made from eggs and oil, two things you couldn't always get but still needed for baking. 1 cup of mayo, a bit of sugar, flour, cocoa, baking soda, and water. That was it. Mix it all in one bowl, pour it into a tin, and bake. The smell was warm and chocolatey, like something from a real bakery. You couldn't taste the mayo. What came out was tender, dark, and moist, a cake that felt like cheating during hard times. Some folks topped it with powdered sugar or leftover frosting from a birthday party. Others just cut it warm and served it plain. The best part? It stayed good for days without drying out. That made it perfect for stretching across a full week. A slice here, a sliver there. It was dessert, snack, comfort, and pride, all wrapped into one battered cake pan. Kids would sneak into the kitchen for crumbs. Parents would save the last piece for the one who had the worst day. It wasn't just cake, it was care. Made with mayonnaise? People would ask. Yes, they'd say. And love. Mock apple pie with Ritz crackers. No apples? No problem. In the 1930s, bakers with empty fruit bowls found a wild solution in their cracker tins. Mock apple pie was born, made not from fruit, but from Ritz crackers, sugar, and a little bit of lemon. It started with a plain pie crust, rolled thin and laid into a tin. Then came the filling. Broken crackers, stacked like apple slices, layered with a syrup made from sugar, water, lemon juice, and cinnamon. Once baked, the crackers softened, puffed slightly, and took on the same bite and texture as cooked apples. It fooled nearly everyone. The smell was sweet and warm, like a proper holiday pie. The crust browned, the filling bubbled, and when you sliced it, you saw layers that looked just right. Some added a pinch of cream of tartar to mimic the tartness of Granny Smith's. Others dropped a pat of butter on top for richness. You'd serve it warm, maybe with whipped milk or a spoon of canned cream if you had any. And the first bite? Sweet, soft, spiced, and just chewy enough to make you believe it came off a tree. It became a point of pride. Try it and tell me that's not apple, folks would say. And more often than not, they were right. Mock apple pie didn't just stretch ingredients. It stretched imagination. It reminded families that even without fresh fruit, you could still serve something that felt like celebration. Vinegar pie. Vinegar in a pie? It sounds like a mistake, but in the hardest years it became a clever substitute for lemons, bringing tartness and depth when fresh citrus was long gone. Vinegar pie was poor folks' answer to lemon meringue, and for many it became a family favorite. The filling was simple: water, sugar, flour, eggs if you had them, and a splash of vinegar. White vinegar gave sharpness. Apple cider vinegar added warmth. A dab of butter went in at the end to mellow it all out. The mixture thickened in a saucepan, then got poured into a waiting pie shell and baked until set. The result was smooth, glossy, and golden. A little tangy, a little sweet. It danced on the tongue like lemon custard, but with its own quiet charm. It was the kind of dessert you didn't talk about much, but you remembered, the kind that showed up on tables with cracked plates and chipped forks, but still made you sit up straight when it arrived. The smell in the oven wasn't fruity, but it was cozy, warm, like caramel and bread and maybe a little spice. When sliced, it wobbled just slightly, holding its shape without fuss. Some topped it with a dusting of sugar. Others just handed you a fork. Vinegar, they'd say, eyebrows raised. Yes, you'd nod, and it's better than you'd think. This was the magic of Depression cooking, turning scraps into comfort, bitterness into sweetness. Golden glow salad, carrot plus pineapple Jell-O. It jiggled, it shimmered. It wasn't quite sweet, wasn't quite savory, But Golden Glow salad brought sunshine to even the gloomiest Dust Bowl dinner tables, using two things that showed up more often than anything else: canned pineapple and grated carrots. Mothers would open a box of lemon or orange gelatin, the cheapest kind they could get, and dissolve it in boiling water. Then they'd stir in crushed pineapple from the tin and handfuls of freshly grated carrots. Sometimes there was celery or raisins, too. The mix would go into a shallow dish or jelly mold and chill on the back porch or inside the icebox if you had one. It came out bright orange or yellow, wobbling on the plate like it was trying to dance. Served cold, it hit the tongue with sweetness and crunch, sunshine and spice. It was dessert, it was salad, it was both, and no one complained. You'd slice it into squares, serve it on a leaf of wilted lettuce, and maybe dollop a bit of mayo or whipped cream on top. The colors made it feel like something from a richer home, something fancy. "Salad's on the table," they'd say, and everyone smiled, because Golden Glow meant someone had managed to scrounge something special. Even when meat was gone and bread was stale, you could still serve something that made the kids laugh and the neighbors curious. And when supper had to be simple and meat was nothing but a memory, families turned again to toast and made it stretch with a can of peas and a cream sauce that started with almost nothing. Creamed peas on toast points. Dinner didn't always need meat to feel like a meal. Sometimes all it took was a few slices of dry bread and a can of peas, transformed into creamed peas on toast points, a soft, buttery dish that looked fancy but cost almost nothing. The toast came first. Bread was sliced on a diagonal, not because it mattered, but because triangles made it feel like you were eating something special. While the slices browned in a pan or on the stove burner, a quick white sauce was made from flour, water, or milk, if you had it, and a bit of butter or drippings. Once thick, a can of peas went in, drained and stirred gently to keep them whole. A little salt, maybe pepper, maybe a pinch of nutmeg or onion powder if the spice tin wasn't empty. The sauce clung to the peas like cream. The peas sat heavy on the toast, sinking into it just a little. You'd cut it with a fork, soft crunch giving way to warmth and richness. It wasn't steak, it wasn't stew, but it felt like supper, and sometimes that was enough. Kids loved the texture. Adults loved how fast it came together. You could stretch one can to feed 4, 5, even 6 if you served small. Toast with peas, someone might ask. But if they ever tasted it, they'd understand. Because sometimes what sat on the table wasn't about flavor. It was about effort, about care, about making do beautifully. And when dessert was just a pot of raisins, sugar, and water, you made pudding from a boil and served it like treasure. Poor man's pudding, boiled raisin pudding. They didn't call it poor man's pudding to be clever. They called it that because it was real, boiled in a single pot, made from dried raisins, water, sugar, and flour. And yet it tasted like something much more expensive. You'd start by boiling raisins in sweetened water until they plumped up like berries. The smell filled the kitchen, warm, sticky, and rich. Then came flour, baking soda, a pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg if you had it. Some stirred in a knob of butter for good luck. The whole thing thickened into a dense, sticky batter. No oven required. You poured it into a tin and steamed it on the stove or dropped spoonfuls into boiling water for dumpling-style pieces. It came out brown, sweet, soft, somewhere between a cake and a cobbler. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even pretty. But it stuck to your ribs and filled the room with comfort. That was dessert on a Tuesday. That was celebration without candles. Kids scraped the pot. Parents saved the last spoonful. It was dessert made from scraps and served with pride. Boiled pudding? Someone might ask. Yes, you'd smile. And better than anything in a box. Mock chop suey, ground beef and celery. When Chinese takeout was just a dream and beef was rationed, families made their own version of chop suey, not with bok choy or bamboo shoots, but with ground beef, celery, and whatever else hadn't run out. It started with a skillet, cast iron if you had it, and a little fat to get things going. Ground beef went in first, browned and bubbling. Celery came next, chopped fine, adding a crunch that almost felt exotic. Onion followed, softening into the mix. If you were lucky, you added a spoon of ketchup or a splash of soy sauce. Most just used salt and pepper, and maybe a shake of flour to thicken it all up. Served over rice, egg noodles, or plain toast, it became something bigger than the sum of its scraps. It was savory, steamy, filling, and with just a little stretch, it fed a whole family. The steam rose up from the pan, while wind rattled the siding outside. You could close your eyes and pretend you were eating something from far away, something fancier than ground beef and celery. That was half the magic. "You're making what?" someone would ask. "Chop suey," came the proud reply. "Our kind." It wasn't takeout. It wasn't fancy, but it fed folks through the leanest years, and sometimes it made them smile. And when the beef ran out and the celery wilted, folks still managed to make cake, with no eggs, no butter, and not even milk. Poverty cake, or war cake. This was the cake made with what you didn't have. No milk, no butter, no eggs, just poverty cake. Also called war cake, because it first fed soldiers and later fed the home front. The ingredients were humble: raisins, sugar, water, flour, baking soda, and spice. You started by boiling raisins with sugar, cinnamon, and cloves until the kitchen smelled like Christmas. That sticky mixture cooled, then got stirred into flour and soda until it thickened to a batter. You'd pour it into a greased pan, no frosting, no frills, and bake until the edges pulled away and the center came out clean. The result? A dark, spiced loaf that stayed moist for days. No eggs needed, no dairy missed. Some folks added nuts when they had 'em. Others used coffee instead of water for a richer taste. But even plain, it was satisfying, sweet, a little chewy, and perfect with black coffee or cold water on the side. Kids didn't know it was a compromise. To them, it was cake, and for families scraping together every crumb, that made it feel like a win. "You made this with no eggs?" folks would ask. "Not a one," they'd grin. "Just a pot, a pan, and a bit of hope." And when there wasn't even that, when there was truly nothing in the pantry but a pot of water and a handful of stories, that's when the folk tale of stone soup became real. Stone soup, folk tale to reality. The story goes that a traveler made soup with just a stone, and little by little people brought what they had until it became a feast. But during the Great Depression, stone soup wasn't just a tale, it was dinner. A pot of water came first, then salt, then the stone, a real one, scrubbed clean. That part made the kids smile. "We're eating rocks?" They'd laugh, but the stone wasn't for flavor, it was for faith. Next came scraps: onion peels, carrot tops, potato ends, a slice of turnip, a bone with no meat. Whatever was left got tossed in and simmered until the smell filled the house. Some added beans or dried peas. Others stirred in barley or old rice. The soup changed with the seasons and the neighbors. Sometimes someone brought celery. Other times it was just herbs from a window box. But it always tasted like more than what went in. Ladled into chipped bowls, served with dry bread or broken crackers, it warmed more than just your stomach. It warmed the air, the mood, the soul. "Stone soup again?" a child might ask, and the mother would smile. "Best kind there is," because stone soup wasn't just about food. It was about sharing, about stretching, about the belief that something could be made from nothing. Hardtack, ship's biscuit, hard as a rock, dry as dust. But hardtack, the same survival biscuit eaten by sailors and soldiers, made its way into Dust Bowl homes when bread was too expensive to bake. Flour, water, and salt. That's it. You'd mix them into a stiff dough, roll it out thick and cut into squares, then poke holes across the top with a fork so it wouldn't puff. Into the oven it went, low and slow, until each biscuit baked hard as a brick. The drier it was, the longer it lasted. Some baked it twice, others left it overnight to toughen. The goal wasn't softness, it was storage. Hardtack could last weeks without molding. You could carry it in your pocket to the fields or wrap it in cloth for the schoolyard. It wasn't fancy, but it filled your belly and held you together. You didn't bite into it straight. That'd break a tooth. You'd soak it in broth, dip it in coffee, or crumble it into milk to soften. Even then, it took chewing. But it was better than going hungry. "Hardtack again?" a boy might groan. "Better than nothing," came the answer. And it was, because in homes with no bread, no yeast, and no time for rising, hardtack meant survival. But when spring came and the weeds returned, families found something green, free for the picking, growing just outside the door. Dandelion greens, foraged. They popped up in the yard like little suns, bright yellow heads with bitter green leaves. To most, dandelions were weeds, but in Depression-era homes, they were food, free food, and that made them precious. You'd pick the young greens early in the season, before the flower bloomed. That's when they were tenderest. Rinse them well, twice, maybe 3 times, to get rid of grit. Then drop them into a pot of boiling water and blanch them just long enough to soften the bite. Some folks sautéed them with bacon grease and onion. Others added vinegar or a pinch of sugar to cut the bitterness. Eaten hot, they tasted a little wild, a little earthy, but they were packed with vitamins, and they filled the plate. Children complained at first. "We're eating grass?" they'd ask. "No," their mother would say. "We're eating what God gave us." Dandelion greens weren't just for supper either. The roots could be dried and ground into coffee substitute. The flowers became syrup, wine, or jelly. Nothing was wasted, not back then. These little leaves fed thousands during the leanest months. They cost nothing. They grew everywhere, and they reminded families that nature always had a backup plan. And when you had more greens than you could eat plain, you could make them into a proper dish. One with hot dressing, crispy edges, and real flavor from the bottom of the skillet. Wilted lettuce salad, hot bacon dressing. In most kitchens, lettuce wilts fast and gets tossed. But during the Great Depression, wilted lettuce was the whole point, the star of a dish that felt like something out of a fancy farmhouse, even when there was barely anything in the cupboard. Wilted lettuce salad with hot bacon dressing turned heat, vinegar, and backyard greens into something memorable. It began early in the day when the garden was still cool and the lettuce leaves hadn't drooped from the sun. Soft, tender greens, usually butterhead, loose leaf, or anything that didn't bolt too fast, were picked by hand and torn, never cut. That was Grandma's rule. "Tearing keeps the flavor in," she'd say. The torn leaves went into a big bowl, sometimes with a few radish slices for bite, or some onion slivers for kick. But the base was always lettuce, fresh, real, alive. Then came the part that made the kids run to peek, the hot dressing. Bacon drippings saved from breakfast went into a skillet with a splash of vinegar, a spoonful of sugar, and maybe a touch of mustard powder or chopped onion. It sizzled, steamed, and smelled like something rich, and then poured straight over the lettuce. The leaves hissed and wilted on contact. The aroma filled the room. You'd toss it quickly, letting the greens soak up every bit of the sweet, tangy fat. It was warm, soft, sharp, and savory all at once. If you had hard-boiled eggs, you'd slice a few on top. If bacon bits survived the pan, they'd be crumbled right in. But even plain, it was good enough for Sunday. Kids would stare, unsure. "You cook the salad?" they'd ask. But the first bite always turned confusion into delight. It hit every taste bud, warm and sweet, sour and smoky, a dish that tasted like it came from more than it actually did. "This is salad?" someone might say, and the answer came with a smile. It's how we made do, because even when meat was rare and vegetables were fading fast, wilted lettuce salad reminded families that flavor didn't come from wealth, it came from wisdom. And when the garden was bare, except for a few pickling jars and a stubborn cabbage head, families didn't give up. They reached for vinegar once again, to whip up a slaw that could last the whole week without spoiling. Bread and butter pickles. They weren't fancy. They weren't even really about bread or butter. But bread and butter pickles earned their place on the table for one simple reason. They made everything else taste better. You started with cucumbers, the kind that came in quick bursts from backyard gardens when rain was kind. You'd slice them into thin rounds, not paper thin, not too thick, just right. Into a crock they went, layered with onions, a handful of ice, and a generous sprinkle of salt. Then you'd wait. By afternoon, the crock had sweat on the outside, the cucumbers had softened, and the onions had mellowed. That's when the real magic began. In a pot, you'd boil vinegar, sugar, mustard seeds, and celery salt. Sometimes a few chili flakes if you wanted heat. The smell hit sharp and sweet, tangy and spiced. It filled the kitchen like something from a fairground and a farmhouse all at once. The brine was poured hot over the drained cucumbers, sealing in flavor. Some folks canned them, packing them into mason jars, wiping the rims, and tightening the lids with strong, careful hands. Others just filled reused jam jars and stashed them in the cellar. Come winter, those pickles came back like sunshine in a spoon, plopped beside hoe cakes, fried potatoes, or a cold slice of salt pork. They lit up the plate. The crunch was sharp. The flavor had layers, sweet, sour, spicy, all wrapped in vinegar and memory. Why, bread and butter? Some say it was because you ate them between slices of buttered bread when nothing else was left. Others say the name came from habit, not meaning, just a way of saying, we're still getting by. These from the store? Someone might ask. And always, always, came the proud answer, nope, these are ours. They were proof of planning, patience, and preservation. They made meals stretch, made mouths pucker, and made ordinary moments feel like tradition. And when cucumbers disappeared and cabbage was the last thing left in the garden, vinegar wasn't done. It had one more job to do. Slicing through poverty with a bite sharp enough to carry a meal. Vinegar Coleslaw. During the Depression, cold slaw didn't come from a plastic tub. It came from a root cellar, a hand-cranked shredder, and a glass jar of sharp, sweet brine. Vinegar Coleslaw was the slaw that never spoiled, because there was no mayo to melt or milk to turn. It started with a head of cabbage. If you were lucky, it came fresh from your own garden, firm, heavy, and still dusty from the ground. You'd cut it thin, or grate it by hand if you had the patience. Sometimes you'd toss in carrots, onions, or even green peppers, depending on what was left in the kitchen basket. The dressing was simple but bold. Vinegar, sugar, salt, and a little water to stretch it. Celery seed added a whisper of spice. Some folks heated the mixture and poured it over the cabbage while it was warm. Others let it sit and soak cold, sealed in a jar that would last all week on the pantry shelf. You stirred it, tasted it, adjusted. The flavors needed time. By the next day, the cabbage had softened just enough. The bite had mellowed, the sweetness had crept in, and every forkful crunched just right. It wasn't creamy, it wasn't rich, but it was alive. It cut through beans and bread like lightning. It refreshed the tongue after fried food or heavy starches. It made tired meals feel new again. Kids called it sour salad. Adults called it practical. Either way, it was gone before the pot of beans ran out. This slaw's got bite, someone would say, and it did, because vinegar was more than just flavor. It was preservation. It was independence. It kept things edible longer, fed more mouths, and stood up to the heat of an Oklahoma summer without curling or spoiling. In homes without fridges, without butter, without mayonnaise, this slaw was the bright note in a long, flat song. And when the slaw was gone and supper needed one more side, folks reached for the one thing they always had, tomatoes and stale bread, and made something bubbling, savory, and sharp that filled the house with smells and stomachs with hope. And when canned tomatoes were piling up and bread was starting to mold, families turned both into something savory, a bubbling dish baked straight into hope. Scalloped tomatoes. When you had canned tomatoes and stale bread, you didn't throw either away. You made scalloped tomatoes. It wasn't a side dish. It wasn't quite a main dish either. It was something in between, and it saved more meals than people remember. It started with bread, the kind no one wanted anymore. Heels, crusts, slices left out too long. You'd tear them into chunks, not too small. Meanwhile, onions went into a hot skillet slicked with bacon grease, softening until translucent. The smell alone could get kids to set the table early. Then came the tomatoes, usually canned, stewed or whole, crushed by hand right into the pan. Salt, sugar, and maybe a pinch of garlic or dried herbs if the spice tin had anything left. Some folks added a splash of vinegar for brightness. Others used a bit of tomato juice in place of water. You'd toss the bread into this mixture, letting it soak like a sponge. All of it went into a baking dish, pressed down gently, then baked until golden on top and bubbling underneath. When it came out of the oven, it didn't look fancy, but it smelled like something warm and real, savory, tangy, a little sweet. The kind of smell that made folks stop mid-sentence and ask, "Is it ready yet?" The top would get a slight crunch. The inside turned into something soft, rich, and almost jammy. You'd spoon it out like pudding, steaming and hearty. It filled your belly and hugged your ribs. Kids didn't care what it was called. They just knew it meant full plates. Some added beans or cheese if they had it. Others paired it with fried potatoes or pickled onions. "Is this made from leftovers?" someone might ask. "No," came the proud reply. "This is supper." It was a dish that showed what a little could become, how forgotten pieces could feed the whole table. And when there was no oven to bake with, and only a skillet and some bacon fat to scrape by, the next dish wasn't just a topping, it was the whole meal. Gravy extended with flour and water. There were nights when the plate looked empty, just a piece of bread, a plain potato, maybe a biscuit with no butter. But when Mama made gravy, that plate suddenly felt full. It wasn't just sauce, it was strategy. Gravy was how you took scraps and turned them into comfort. It started with fat, bacon grease, sausage drippings, even the golden bits left in a cast iron pan after frying onions. You didn't waste a drop. That fat went back on the heat. Next came the flour, sifted in slowly, stirred constantly with a wooden spoon until it browned just right. Not too dark, not too pale. This was called the roux, but nobody said that word. They just said, "Keep stirring." Water went in next, sometimes milk, if there was any. The key was to pour it slow and whisk fast. No lumps allowed. The smell turned deep and nutty. The texture smooth as cream. It was thin, but rich. It stretched far. You'd drizzle it over dry bread, over fried potatoes, over rice. You'd sop it up with your fingers if no fork was clean. Kids scraped their plates clean with the last crust of bread. If there was black pepper, you used plenty. Some added bouillon or dried onion. Others flavored it with salt pork scraps or even mashed beans. There were no rules, only resourcefulness. "No meat tonight?" a kid might ask, and someone would answer, "This is better," because it wasn't about meat. It was about making something out of nothing, about sitting down to a warm meal, no matter what the cupboards looked like. It felt like dinner, one woman said, even when it wasn't. Gravy made the meal stretch. It added flavor to the flavorless, and it gave dignity to food that might have looked like scraps. When times were good, gravy was a bonus. When times were hard, it was a miracle. And next to it, bubbling in a pan and waiting to be sliced, was a golden block of cornmeal that had been setting overnight. A dish that didn't need much, just a flame, a pan, and a spoon. And when the main dish had to be built from scratch, no protein, just grit, they turned again to a childhood favorite, cornmeal mush, the hot golden belly filler that never let families down. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal mush didn't try to impress. It didn't sparkle, and it didn't change much from one home to the next. But during the Dust Bowl, it was a hero in a pot, thick, hot, and dependable when little else could be. You'd heat water in a dented pot, waiting for it to simmer. Then in went the cornmeal, slow, steady, stirred by hand with the same wooden spoon used for everything else. No timers, no recipes, just rhythm and experience. Too fast, and it clumped like cement. Just right, and it turned into a golden porridge that bubbled and breathed like something alive. Salt if you had it, a knob of lard or butter if you were lucky. But most often it was plain, a big, steaming gleaming mound on a chipped plate, filling the house with a warm, faintly sweet smell that clung to the curtains. Fresh off the stove, it was soft and spoonable. You'd eat it like grits or polenta, letting it sit in your belly like a warm stone. Kids sometimes got a drizzle of sorghum or syrup on top if there was extra. Adults just ate in silence, grateful. The magic came the next day. The leftover mush was poured into a loaf pan to set overnight. Come morning, it was sliced thick, solid like cold pudding, and fried in bacon grease until the edges turned crisp and golden. The contrast was perfect. Creamy inside, crunchy outside. Some folks called it depression toast. Mama used to say the mush stayed warm longer than the house, one woman laughed. And it did. Cornmeal was cheap, lasted forever, and didn't need refrigeration. That made it a pantry essential. It filled stomachs. It fed silence. It reminded families that even when the sky turned black with dust, something hot could still come from the stove. And when even that felt too familiar, folks turned to canned fish, leftover toast, and a white sauce they could make blindfolded to create a meal that felt oddly elegant in a world that was falling apart. Creamed tuna on toast. This was the dish that made the family feel like company was coming, even if it was just another Tuesday night in 1935. Creamed tuna on toast was the closest most Dust Bowl families got to fancy. But in truth, it was a masterpiece of making do. It started with a can. Tuna in oil was preferred, but packed in water would do. You'd open it with a worn church key opener, drain the liquid into a cup, some saved it for the cat, and flake the meat with a fork. Next came the white sauce. A few spoonfuls of flour stirred into hot fat, usually lard or bacon drippings, then slowly thinned with water or milk if you had it. Stirred constantly, it thickened to a creamy base. In went the tuna, sometimes with a few peas, or chopped onions or celery if the garden gave enough. A splash of vinegar or lemon juice gave it bite. Salt and pepper were precious but used with care. The result? A rich, silky sauce that turned a 10-cent can into dinner for 5. You toasted whatever bread you had, homemade or store-bought, fresh or going stale. The slices were laid flat on a plate, and the hot tuna cream spooned over top, soaking into every crack and corner. It looked like something from a hotel, if you squinted. Kids called it the good stuff. Adults sat a little taller when they ate it. It felt like dignity in the middle of despair. It tasted like better days, one mother said, like we hadn't lost everything. It filled bellies without cleaning out the pantry. And more importantly, it reminded everyone that care in the kitchen still mattered. It was rich, salty, creamy, familiar. And when served with sliced tomatoes or pickles on the side, it almost felt like a proper meal from a world that no longer existed. And just like that, with a can, a spoon, and a skillet, a mother could turn war rations and bread heels into something her kids remembered years later. Not as a hardship, but as comfort on a plate. Creamed cabbage. Cabbage didn't just survive the Dust Bowl, it thrived in it. Hardy, cheap, and long-lasting, it became one of the few vegetables folks could count on. And when it was creamed just right, creamed cabbage turned a tough leaf into a tender memory. It started with a big green head, probably stored in the cellar since the fall. You'd peel off the outer leaves, sometimes spotted or limp, until you got to the crisp center. Then you'd slice it thin, like ribbons, and boil it in salted water until it softened. Some families used rainwater when well pumps failed, pouring it carefully into dented pots over open flames. Meanwhile, you made a simple white sauce from flour, butter, or lard, and milk, though sometimes water stood in. You'd stir and stir, careful not to scorch it. Once smooth, the cabbage got folded in. The mixture thickened, turned creamy, and let off a scent that was both warm and faintly sweet. Not bitter like raw cabbage, but mellowed and homey. For those who had it, a splash of vinegar or a pinch of nutmeg added dimension. A few even dropped in crumbled bacon or a bit of onion for richness. But the truth was, it didn't need much. Creamed cabbage was soft, silky, and deeply satisfying, especially spooned over boiled potatoes or a slab of toasted bread. "Mama said cabbage kept us strong," one woman recalled. "It didn't lie." You'd serve it hot, with steam curling off the plate. The sauce stuck to everything: spoons, fingers, plates, and not a drop was wasted. It stretched far. It stored well. It turned something tough into something tender. And when meat was back on the menu, even if it came in a can, folks turned to another pantry miracle: the humble salmon patty, fried golden and shared with pride. Salmon patties. During the Dust Bowl, a can of salmon felt like a luxury. It came from far away, oceans most folks had never seen, yet it sat on dry shelves in Oklahoma and Kansas, waiting to become dinner. Salmon patties took that luxury and made it stretch like magic. You'd open the can and dump the contents into a bowl. Juice, bones, skin, all of it, nothing went to waste. You mashed it with a fork, mixing in an egg, breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, maybe chopped onion or celery if you had it. A little mustard added tang. Milk made it moist. Mix turned thick, sticky, and full of promise. Formed into patties by hand, they were flattened like biscuits and fried in lard, bacon fat, or oil until golden brown. The kitchen filled with a savory, seared smell that made stomachs growl. Crispy on the outside, warm and flaky inside, the perfect contrast in every bite. Kids ate them like burgers. Adults broke them apart with cornbread. Some wrapped them in wax paper for the fields. Leftovers, if there were any, got reheated the next morning and eaten cold. No complaints. "They were Sunday food on a Wednesday night," one man said. "You felt like you were eating high." Even those who hated fish came around. The crisp crust, the rich flavor, the way it filled you up without emptying the pantry. It was a depression miracle. And the best part? It came from a can that cost a few cents and made enough for the whole family. But when meat and fish were gone, and the pantry held only beans and broken hot dogs, folks still found a way to make supper feel complete. Baked beans with hot dogs. Cans of beans were a constant, cheap, hearty, and shelf-stable. But they weren't exciting until someone added hot dogs, baked them slow, and turned a few pantry scraps into a warm, savory supper. Baked beans with hot dogs. It began with a can of pork and beans, or navy beans in tomato sauce. You dump it into a dish. No draining, no rinsing. Then came the extras. A spoonful of brown sugar, a squirt of mustard, a splash of vinegar or ketchup if you had it. Some folks stirred in chopped onions or molasses for depth. Each family had their own twist. Then came the hot dogs, usually cheap, pink, and bologna soft. You'd slice them thin, coins, half-moons, even strips, to make them go further. Mix it all together and bake it slow until the sauce thickened, the dogs curled at the edges, and the smell drifted down the hall. The result was more than the sum of its parts. It was sticky, savory, just a little sweet. Served with cornbread, biscuits, or plain white bread, it filled the belly and satisfied the soul. Kids loved it. Adults accepted it, and everyone went back for seconds. If you could smell it from the porch, you ran to wash your hands, one boy remembered. You knew supper was going to be hot and real. Some made big batches for church dinners. Others saved it for Saturday night. It reheated well, kept folks full, and cost almost nothing to make. And when there was no meat, not even a hot dog, families turned to liver, rich in iron, strong in flavor, and, when cooked right, something even the kids would remember fondly. Liver and onions. Liver was never anyone's first choice. When the cupboard was bare and the body needed strength, it was the only thing standing between a family and real hunger. During the Dust Bowl, liver and onions wasn't just a meal, it was medicine. You'd get it from the butcher cheap, sometimes even free if he liked you. A dark, dense slab that looked nothing like the tender roasts people dreamed about, but it was packed with iron, protein, and fat. Three things your body desperately needed when food was scarce and work was backbreaking. First, mothers soaked it in milk, if they had any, to mellow out. What came next softened the whole room. Onions sliced into half-moons and fried slowly in bacon grease or lard until golden and sweet. They filled the house with the smell of something warm and kind. Then the liver hit the pan, hot, fast, sizzling, browned just enough to keep it tender, never rubbery. If you cooked it too long, you'd ruin the whole batch. It required care and a little faith. Kids groaned when they saw it coming, but they still ate every bite. "It'll put color in your cheeks," mothers would say. And over time they were right. That liver kept families going through sickness, cold winters, and days without anything else in the icebox. Some served it over mashed potatoes. Others laid it out beside rice or bread heels. The onions always went on top, soft, glistening, and full of flavor. And the gravy in the pan? You'd better believe it got scraped into a jar and saved for tomorrow's meal. "Liver night meant we were broke," one man said, but it also meant we were still fighting. It wasn't a celebration dish, but it was a survival dish. Rich, honest, and hard to forget. And when meat was gone altogether, and all you had was a bowl of cold mashed potatoes from yesterday's supper, there was still a way to turn them into something crispy, hot, and deeply satisfying. Potato pancakes from mashed potatoes. Leftovers weren't thrown out. They were reborn. And when you had a pot of cold mashed potatoes and not much else, potato pancakes turned what looked like waste into a skillet full of golden magic. You'd start with whatever was left, dry, lumpy mash that had sat in a pot on the back of the stove overnight. Into a bowl it went. You'd add flour to bind, a bit of milk to loosen, and if the chickens had been kind, an egg, then salt, pepper, maybe chopped onion or garlic for bite. Mix got stirred until thick, then shaped by hand or dropped with a spoon into a hot pan slicked with bacon grease or lard. It sizzled on contact, browning fast at the edges and crisping into a lace of gold. Flip, press, wait. Inside, they stayed soft and creamy. Outside, crunchy and rich. Each pancake had a rustic beauty, uneven, browned in patches, smelling like home. Kids dipped them in applesauce. Adults drizzled gravy or ketchup. Some stacked them up like sandwiches, folding in a slice of onion or cheese if they had it. And there was pride in serving them. They didn't feel like scraps. They felt like something hot, filling. Came to the table fast, cooked in batches, eaten before they cooled. They filled stomachs and stretched rations, and they reminded families that even with nothing new, you could still make something good. No one called them poor man's food. They called them supper. And when there was still a bit of rice left in the pot and a spoonful of sugar in the pantry, families ended the day with something sweet, creamy, warm, and kissed with cinnamon. Rice pudding, baked. When times were tight and dessert felt like a luxury, baked rice pudding reminded families that sweetness didn't have to come from a store. It could come from the leftovers, the pantry scraps, and a little heat in the oven. It started with rice, cold, cooked, and clumpy from the night before. You'd fluff it with a fork, then stir in milk or water, sugar, a beaten egg if there was one, and a pinch of salt. Cinnamon was almost always included. Nutmeg, if you had it. Raisins were a blessing, little bursts of sweetness that plumped up as they baked. Some added a splash of vanilla. Others stirred in a knob of butter. But the core of it, rice, milk, sugar, heat, never changed. You poured it all into a buttered dish, set it in the oven, and waited. Slow baking turned the mixture into something magical. The top browned, the center firmed up, and the smell, oh, the smell, filled the whole house. Warm, spicy, nostalgic. It wasn't served with whipped cream. It didn't need it. It was served with pride. You spooned it into bowls while still hot, or let it cool to slice the next morning. Kids licked their spoons clean. Adults sighed and leaned back in their chairs. "Sweetest thing we had all week," one man said, "and it came from scraps. It used what you already had. It didn't cost extra, and yet it felt like something special. The top might crack when you dipped in. The bottom might stick just a little, but the taste? Pure comfort. It was proof that even in lean years, joy could still be found in a simple bowl. And when fall came around and apples were in season and the oven was still warm, folks knew there was one last treat they could count on: soft fruit, cinnamon, and the smell of home baked into every bite. Baked apples with cinnamon and raisins. When sugar was rare and dessert seemed like a distant dream, baked apples became a symbol of hope. They came straight from the tree, cost nothing, and smelled like something a grandmother would make just to say, "Everything's going to be all right." You'd start by coring each apple, not slicing, not peeling, just removing the heart. A knife would twist slowly, carefully, leaving the apple whole but hollow in the center. Into that little pocket, you'd pack a mix of raisins, sugar, or honey or molasses, a pat of butter, and a heavy dusting of cinnamon. Some families added oats or chopped nuts if they had them. Most just used what was on hand, whatever could turn a plain fruit into a soft, sticky, sweet surprise. The apples were arranged in a battered baking dish, water or cider poured in to steam them gently. Then they were baked low and slow, filling the entire house with the smell of autumn. Warm fruit, melted sugar, and comfort. They split as they softened. Skin wrinkled, juice pooled in the bottom of the dish. You'd spoon the syrup over the top just before serving. Each bite was soft and spicy, a combination of tart skin, melting flesh, and that gooey raisin core. You didn't need whipped cream. You didn't need ice cream. This was dessert from the earth itself, humble, wholesome, and soul-filling. "They made me forget we were broke," one woman said. "For 10 minutes we felt rich." Baked apples were more than a recipe. They were a ritual, made after chores, served after supper, eaten slow. And when sweet potatoes came in season, sticky, orange, full of sugar even without a spoonful added, another golden comfort took the table. Candied sweet potatoes, or yams. Some nights, the only candy came from nature itself, and candied sweet potatoes were the golden miracle that made people believe sweetness still existed in hard times. You'd start with big, knobby sweet potatoes, not the smooth, waxed ones we know today. These were dirt-covered, dug by hand, and hard as rocks. You peeled them slowly, sliced them thick, and dropped them into a pot of boiling water just long enough to soften. Then came the real magic, the baking. You'd layer the softened slices in a dish, add pats of butter, or bacon grease if butter was gone, sprinkle brown sugar between the layers. If there was molasses or maple syrup, just a drizzle. Cinnamon, cloves, or nutmeg came next, whatever was on hand. Then they went into the oven, uncovered, slow baking until the sugar caramelized, the edges crisped, and the scent of toasted sweetness danced through every room in the house. The potatoes turned sticky, golden, and rich. The tops would bubble and crackle. The bottoms soaked up all the syrup, turning into soft, sugar-drenched bites that melted on your tongue. Kids fought over the corners. Adults saved theirs for last. It was a side dish, technically, but tasted like dessert. "They were the closest thing we got to pie," one farmer joked. "And sometimes they were better. You didn't need a pie crust. You didn't need a full pantry. Just earth-grown sweetness and the patience to bake it slow. It fed a family and reminded them that flavor didn't have to be bought. And if you still had corn hanging from the rafters, dry as dust and waiting for a purpose, you could turn it into something hot, buttery, and loud with flavor, cooked up in a cast-iron skillet and gone before it even cooled. Fried corn. Fried corn was the sound of summer stretching into fall. You could hear it before you smelled it. The sizzle, the pop, the hiss of kernels hitting hot fat in a skillet. And in Dust Bowl homes, It was a celebration dish made from one of the few things that still grew, corn. Whether fresh from the cob or cut from dried kernels soaked overnight, corn was everywhere. You'd shuck it, scrape it, and catch every kernel in a big bowl. Some used a spoon, others used a knife edge and bare hands. Every bit mattered. You'd heat a cast-iron skillet over the fire, add lard, butter, or bacon grease, whatever you had. When it shimmered, the corn went in with a big scoop. It hissed loud and fast, spitting up steam and scent. You stirred constantly, scraping up the browning bits from the bottom. Some added chopped onion, bell pepper, or green tomato. Others kept it plain, just salt and a lot of black pepper. The corn softened but never turned mushy. The edges browned. The smell deepened. Spoon it onto plates, hot and loud. Eat fast. It didn't stay warm long. Kids loved the crispy kernels. Adults loved how far it stretched. Some stirred in a splash of milk at the end to make it creamy. Others dusted it with cornmeal for crunch. "My daddy called it farm caviar," one daughter remembered. "We laughed, then we begged for seconds. It was cheap, fast, and satisfying. It came from your own land, and when meat was gone and the garden failed, fried corn still came through. It ended meals, it started mornings, it filled the gaps, and it brought this journey full circle, from water pie to fried corn, from storm clouds to stove smoke, from hunger to hope. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the forgotten kitchens of the Dust Bowl, where every dish told a story of strength, sacrifice, and sheer determination. These meals weren't just recipes. They were lifelines, passed down through cast-iron pans, backyard gardens, and the quiet wisdom of those who made do with almost nothing. If one of these dishes brought back a memory, your grandmother's stove, your father's garden, or a meal you didn't realize was special until years later, we'd love to hear about it. Drop your favorite in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to remember their roots. And if you found comfort or curiosity in these forgotten flavors, please share this video with a friend or family member. It helps keep this knowledge alive, not just for us, but for the next generation, because history doesn't fade when we pass it on.